All right, everybody, thank you so much for joining us. We hope you're enjoying your day, whether you're on your lunch break, maybe at home, cleaning the house, hopefully. It's 12:30. I'm Maria Moreau. I'm joined here by my friend and colleague, Tim Darnell. Tim, we're talking about something very timely and on a lot of voters' minds as we head into the election, which is just 2 weeks away, by the way. And that is all eyes being on Congress and really our national state of politics. And that's kind of what I wanted to bring you on here. You have been involved in Atlanta, Georgia politics for quite some time as a journalist. Wanted to get your perspective on having covered so much of this in the past and now analyzing and discussing with experts and political analysts the current state that we're heading in here in 2 weeks. The two powers right now, the Senate and the House. Obviously, those seats are up for grabs, and that could influence a number of things here that are affecting voters, that are affecting you who might be watching. Let's talk a little bit about that. From what the AP is reporting, the Republicans have a good chance of taking back control of Congress.
And that's going to have a lot of long-ranging ramifications, Maria. Historically, and this has happened every time in the modern era, within the last 4 to 5 decades. Historically, during a midterm election, a sitting president who is in his first term of office, whichever party he belongs to, has historically fared very, very poorly in those midterm elections. And this year is shaping up to be no different. President Joe Biden, obviously a member of the Democratic Party. Democrats hold majorities in the House and a very, very thin, razor-thin majority in the United States Senate. As a result, over the past couple of years, the president has enjoyed a good, fairly good solid level of legislative and political success, putting through his infrastructure plan, putting through the so-called Inflation Reduction Plan or Act, which drew the ire of a lot of members of the National Republican Party. We're going to find out in a couple of weeks, 14 days to be exact, just how popular those policies and plans have been. But right now, we're looking at a possibility of Republicans actually being able to flip the United States House. Democrats have held the House since 2018. Republicans only need to net 5 seats among the dozens that are considered battleground states across the nation in order to gain a majority in the U.S. House.
And I want to be clear, we're not going to speculate on how this election is going to turn out because we don't know, but we are going to be talking about this from an analytical standpoint, from history, from what we're currently seeing with early voting. So let's get into it. By the way, if you have questions, thoughts, please comment them below. We'll be looking through all of our live stream channels on Facebook and YouTube, getting you involved in this conversation. Let's talk about the scenario where the House flips. What are the biggest consequences or the biggest effects that we'll first see out of that?
We will begin to see effects immediately when the new congressional session convenes in January. It'll convene on January 3rd. If Republicans have won a majority in the House, they will immediately elect, more than likely, Kevin McCarthy, Republican from California, as the new House Speaker. That's not a given, but right now he is the leading candidate to become the next House Speaker if Republicans take control. Immediately, you're the first item on his agenda, as he's already unveiled in his commitment to America, is to repeal the funding that President Biden and congressional Democrats approved to hire an additional 87,000 Internal Revenue Service agents. They will also immediately repeal the funding for a lot of the president's and Democratic efforts for climate change, perhaps some infrastructure bills as well. Kevin McCarthy is really modeling his 2022 Republican campaign for the House on what happened back in 1994. In 1994, Bill Clinton was in his first term as the newly elected Democratic president. A Metro Atlanta congressman named Newt Gingrich unveiled a contract with America that swept Republicans into power for the first time in almost 40 years. It had never really happened before until that. And that in 1994, that sent shockwaves throughout the nation's capital and throughout the nation's entire political infrastructure. Kevin McCarthy is looking to pull off the same feat in 14 days.
And we see something like this happening time and time again. My question, of course, with the thought of the voter, the American that's going to be affected by all this in mind, when you have a president and you have an opposing party as the legislative branch, you essentially hit this standstill where nothing
gridlock.
goes
Right,
through.
right.
Is that fair to the American voter?
The American voter certainly seem to think so, because these are the political parties and the arrangements that voters place into power. I've often thought that perhaps gridlock government is favored by many Americans, because when we see one party unilaterally sitting in the White House, the U.S. House of Representatives, and the Senate, as Donald Trump encountered that, and Barack Obama when he was first elected in the early 2000s. Barack Obama, mostly universally thought of as a very effective and beloved president, suffered historic losses his first two midterm elections when he was in office. So I tend to think that perhaps the American voter is a little bit smarter than a lot of the people that we elect into power, and that perhaps gridlock government is something that they're in favor of.
And let's talk about Donald Trump for a moment. You brought him up. This is being called a win for him if Republicans are able to take back power because of the ongoing January 6th investigation.
It is, and now the former president has been very critical of House-led impeachment efforts. He was the only president ever to be impeached twice. And he would obviously see that as a victory and a vindication for his administration. We can also look to see perhaps Marjorie Taylor Greene from Georgia's 14th congressional district has made it very abundantly clear that she would like to file articles of impeachment against President Joe Biden. Marjorie Taylor Greene was removed of all of her committee assignments by ruling Democrats in the House for her outspoken viewpoints. Yet last month, she was standing shoulder to shoulder with Kevin McCarthy as he unveiled his commitment to America during a Pennsylvania campaign stop. So we can expect to see a lot more sharply divided partisan politics, but perhaps that's what the American voters are choosing when they cast ballots in 2 weeks.
And let's talk about the other side of this, the scenario where the Democrats keep power. President Biden said if that happens, that he would, as his first order of business, codify Roe v. Wade.
Right.
Now, the big question right now is, one, why wait? But two, is that likely what would happen in this scenario as the first act the Democrats take?
I think it would be among the first acts, Maria. I don't know if it would be the actual first, but why hasn't that already been done? From a purely political and pragmatic standpoint, you have to believe that perhaps Democrats want to use the issue of possibly Republicans banning abortion outright as a politically motivated tool to encourage their voters to go to the polls in 2 weeks. That may be a cynical point of view, but it's certainly from a politically and a pragmatic standpoint one that's very logical. Why would you want to take away an issue that you're using to mobilize your voters and nullify that as a form of motivating people to go to the polls and cast their ballots for your party?
Right, and let's talk about some of the other issues that are at focus. One of the biggest things voters have stated that matters to them is the state of the economy. We are dealing with inflation, rising prices. I was just at the grocery store yesterday and couldn't believe my bill for considering I buy the same thing every week. So small things like that the voter is seeing every day in their life and feeling in their wallets. How would each party take on the economy moving forward? We have the Democrats who are already essentially responding with the power that they have, and Republicans who are including this heavily in their campaign trail.
Economy inflation, gas prices, those are the number one issues, poll after poll, such as you're mentioning yourself, that you're feeling every day when you go to the gas pump, when you go to buy groceries or essentials. That's why the Biden White House consistently reaches out to Atlanta News First every day and news media outlets around the United States, wanting their policy, their economic policy experts and analysts to be interviewed and essentially telling the American people, here's how we're tackling those issues. That's a very risky proposition for Democrats to pin their hopes on, that perhaps issues such as gun control or gun rights or abortion are at the top of voters' minds, and those are the issues they're hoping will drive their voters to the polls in 14 days. And yet poll after poll shows the economy, inflation are the number one issues. Kevin McCarthy's part of his commitment to America are tax breaks, reducing the number of IRS agents who could, in theory, go after everyday Americans rather than the super or the ultra rich, as Democrats have claimed, and are campaigning on platforms of lower government spending. Republicans are also saying that the Democrats and President Biden's overall government spending programs are contributing to that inflation. Whether or not that's true or not, time will tell. But there are very, very differing, almost violently different philosophies that each party is bringing to the table in terms of the nation's overall economic climate.
And I want to talk about some of the other issues at hand, speaking a little bit to my younger audience possibly. Student debt relief. Of course, that has hit a weird point. I shouldn't say a weird point, a contentious point right now with the movement of this relief. Of course, we were hoping that it was going to come on Sunday. We knew that wasn't going to happen with the legal challenges at play. So now that is up. With the Republicans taking back power, would this essential relief be stripped away? Is this something that they have commented on in the past?
Republicans are wisely staying away from commenting on this because it is a very popular, very partisan issue, and yet one that affects the voting demographic, the younger voters, who typically and historically, from a purely statistical standpoint, don't necessarily go to the polls as often or as religiously as those older voters. So this is something that President Biden and the Democratic Party have passed. You can, from a cynical standpoint, you can say, well, they only did it during an election year. So what if they did? It's still an issue, and it's still on the referendum and at the top of voters' minds. Stacey Abrams, every Democratic candidate across the nation, from governor to congressman to U.S. Senate and elsewhere down to the local level, have made a lot of efforts to recruit and motivate those younger voters to go to the polls. And this is obviously an issue that's designed, tailor-made to impact that emotional issue among demographically younger voters.
So with 2 weeks out until this very important, some say historical midterm election, I want to bring this conversation back to the voter, because at the end of the day, the Americans are going to be the ones feeling the impacts of these laws, of the movement of our political parties. What should the voter keep in mind as they're either headed to the polls to vote or just following this election?
Educate yourself, learn about all of the candidates. Yes, there the nation is very partisanly and politically divided, nowhere more so than here in Georgia, where we basically have a 45% split with Democrats and Republicans in those camps. If you're an undecided voter, listen to the candidates, learn about their platforms, learn about their policy positions. Television commercials, hey, we're all tired of them, and yet, there's millions of dollars that are being made in TV political advertisements. Don't let those be your only source of information. Take the time to educate yourself, go to the polls, and cast your ballot. Every single solitary vote counts. If we've seen nothing over the past several election cycles, is that every single vote counts. Ask Stacey Abrams, who would be in the governor's mansion right now, had an op-ed for about 55,000 votes that went against her toward Governor Brian Kemp. Ask President Joe Biden, who is sitting in the White House, mainly because Georgia became the first deep southern state to go Democratic during this past presidential election by only a few thousand votes. Your vote counts. Take the time to educate yourself, and by all means, whether it's early voting, which we're seeing, record-breaking turnout beyond any in numbers that no one could have predicted, but also on election day, just be sure to cast your ballot.
And the best way, if you are looking for those online resources just to get more information about candidates that you are going to be voting for, is to go to our website, atlantanewsfirst.com. Tim Darnell, other members of our digital team, and staff here at Atlanta News First are constantly putting out information, talking to these candidates, and getting their platforms and their thoughts and their hopes for the country out to the public so that you can make an informed decision. So we'll have all of that on atlantanewsfirst.com. Tim, thank you so much.
Thank you.